Yes, sports.
High drive, center field, hit the wall, grand slam. This is magnificent.
Got a fantasy question? Email fantasybaseball@cbsi.com. Get ready to win your league.
Where fantasy becomes reality.
Now here's Frank, Scott, Chris, and Adam.
Now, what if I told you the 8th catcher off the board in ADP led all catchers in max exit velocity and barrel rate in 2020, plus has 2 full seasons with an OPS over 840? Welcome to our 2021 position previews here on Fantasy Baseball Today, and we're starting with the best position. That's right, catchers. Frank Stanfield, joined as always by Scott White and Chris Towers. We'll cover everything on catchers today, strategy, ADP, 5 big questions, and topics for the position, sleepers, breakouts, busts, prospects, our favorite catcher to draft, and everything in between. If you're listening to the podcast, you're hearing this on Tuesday, February 9th, but we're actually live right now on YouTube and Twitch on Monday, February 8th. And we're going to keep doing the pod live on video moving forward. So we're happy to have you here. What's going on, Scott? You excited about 38-year-old Yadier Molina returning to the St. Louis Cardinals?
Oh, I am just overjoyed about Yadier Molina returning to the Cardinals. No, he's pretty low relevance at this point. I mean, he matters in 2 catcher leagues. He still good at making contact and still tends to play a lot, though. At some point, you got to figure his at-bats are going to be curtailed here at some point. But, doesn't offer a lot of power anymore, and just not much reason to make a big investment in him. I would guess it's likely at some point, even in 1 catcher leagues, he becomes relevant just because others wash out and he just is steady Eddie back there. But yeah, he's certainly not somebody to really pay for in fantasy anymore.
Volume is the name of the game for one Yadier Molina. The ADP for Yadi is currently 282 as the 15th catcher off the board. He was a top 3 catcher in both head-to-head points and roto back in 2018, but he's not getting any younger. Chris is here as well. What's going on, Chris? Any guesses as to which catcher I was referring to in the opening?
Yeah, I would guess just off the top of my head, it's also probably the same catcher who led catchers in infield fly balls. And that's Gary Sanchez, who is maybe the single most all-or-nothing hitter in baseball at this point.
A lot more on Gary Sanchez coming a little bit later on in the podcast as well. Are people sleeping on the Sanchez? We'll find out. But let's just start with a little catcher strategy in general. In 2 catcher leagues, Scott, which is the most traditional 5x5 roto. That's where we'll most often use the 2 catchers there. What is your strategy for that format usually?
In a 2 catcher league?
Yep.
You said? Well, I mean, I don't have a go-to strategy. I never invest in like 2 high-end catchers. And I wouldn't even say that. There was a year where I did and it worked out okay. But generally speaking, that's not the way to go because you have to pay up so much for any one high-end catcher that you're really sacrificing in other areas to do it twice. But I don't know that I can safely call anyone a high-end catcher in this year's player pool except for JT Realmuto. I feel like he might be the most significant advantage you can get at any position. So this year, more than any other, I don't know that I would invest heavily in any catcher, even in a 2 catcher league, and unless the value is just great. Like I've seen it in a lot of our mocks. Salvador Perez, who I rank 2nd at the position, if he lasts to like round 11 or something like that, I'll go ahead and scoop him up. Wilson Contreras, same thing. But unless there's a clear discount of 2 or 3 rounds like that, probably just going to keep passing it up until you get to the later stages, and then maybe take, I don't know, a James McCann type, a Christian Vasquez type as my number 1.
Speaking of those specific names, Scott, do you have any rules when it comes to specifically two catcher leagues, like, do you tell yourself I have to get one of my top blank catchers, right? Like I have to get one of my top 10 and then I'll target whatever, one of my top 20 or 25 later on as my second catcher. Do you have any rules like that when it comes to this format?
Like I said, I have in the past. I don't think this is the year for it. If you're settling for like Max Stassi as your number one catcher, that's probably waiting a little longer than you should. So maybe like one of my top 12 or 13, and that's including guys like Vasquez and McCann, who I mentioned, also like Mitch Garver, Sean Murphy. I might know. I would prefer not to have less than that as my number one, but if there's some sleeper pitcher I like at the same, and I'm making that call, do I settle for a lower end number one catcher than I want, or take the pitcher who I really like? Then forget the catcher. I don't really care about the position much at all, is what I'm trying to say.
If it's a roto league, I'm okay probably with like any of my I think it's like my top 13 at catcher as my number one. And if I could get two of those guys, going down to Dalton Varsho. If I can get any of my top 13 as my number one, I'm okay with that. And ideally two of them. But for the most part, they've got to be real values.
Yeah, I definitely want at least one of my top 11. That's the number that stood out to me. And the cutoff was James McCann, Christian Vasquez. I have Sean Murphy up at number 9. But once you get past Vasquez, for me, it's Mitch Garver, Dalton Varsho, Jorge Alfaro, which some might consider okay options. But as we'll see in ADP as we go over it, there is just a huge drop-off in ADP after names like Vasquez and James McCann. There's like a 30-40 pick drop. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. Chris, why do we play into catcher league still? Why don't we just make everything a one catcher league? Because we know that catcher is already the worst position. This would be, in my mind, the same as playing fantasy football with two tight ends. Tight end is by far the worst position, and we play with one of them. Why do we play with two catchers in fantasy baseball?
Because the guys who were playing fantasy baseball at a like a chicken place, isn't that the story back in like the late 70s? Because they decided that that's how they were going to play, and so we've stuck with that. It's tradition.
I think there's more to it than tradition. Actually, if you play in a one catcher league, because nobody plays a catcher eligible player anywhere but catcher. If you're playing in a league where there's just 12 catchers rostered and there are, there are 13 other hitter spots to fill, 12 other hitter spots to fill. You look at the waiver wire and it's all catchers at the top. Like ideally it would be something like 1.5 catcher spots to be distributed evenly, equitably compared to other positions. But since you can't have half a catcher, obviously it rounds up to 2.
So,
and like, I don't think anybody's disadvantaged by that. Everybody has a crappy second catcher.
Right. It just, I guess part of the problem is if you just played 14 hitters in a roto league, 13 hitter spots. Let's just say you had to fill 13 hitter spots. How many catchers would get drafted in a 12-team league as a starter? If you just played, the best 156 hitters. For me, I think it's one. I think Realmuto is the only one that I would definitely draft as a starter. Last year, there were 4 catchers in the top 100 in roto scoring without any kind of positional adjustment. None were inside the top 40. And this was with, I think we can all agree Salvador Perez playing over his head and a couple other guys, really having big years that we don't expect them to repeat. There were 7 players inside the top 100 at second base. There were 13 at shortstop. And so the problem is you have to play players who wouldn't otherwise be fantasy relevant just because of the position.
I guess it's a question of whether you want the position overrepresented or underrepresented. Like I said, I think 1.5 would perfectly represent the position compared to like shortstops. But that's not really an option. So,
but everyone's playing this. It's all about strategy. And a lot of the times getting a catcher who doesn't hurt you in a roto league is as good as anything you're going to get.
Yeah. In one catcher league, specifically in head-to-head points, I mean, I think volume is obviously very important there, but you can say that about any position. I think it's even more important in when it comes to the catcher position in particular for that format. Scott, in daily leagues, I just wanted to bring this up in a head-to-head categories league, which is, I think, the more often than not, that's the format that uses a daily lineup context. Would you draft a catcher tandem? So whenever someone's sitting, you can plug in their backup. It takes up one of your bench spots, but theoretically you will have a catcher playing every day. Whereas if you have one, I mean, you know that they're probably going to sit out at least once or twice a week. So what do you think about that? Using a catcher tandem in a daily format?
Well, daily formats aren't my go-to anyway, but I have played in enough to have an opinion. And my opinion is, no, that's not the best use of a bench spot. Really,
how many catcher tandems would you even want to use?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's
like the one that I always think back to, and I thought it was more recent than this, but it was the 2017 Braves when Kurt Suzuki and Tyler Flowers combined for 31 homers. Mm-hmm. Other than that, like the teams who have multiple good catchers right now are extremely. I mean, the teams that have one good catcher are pretty few and far between. So,
yeah. The teams,
maybe the Diamondbacks.
The Diamondbacks, they have.
But even then, their best catcher for fantasy isn't actually part of their catcher rotation, most likely.
Right, yeah. And we'll talk about Varsho a little bit later on. But yeah, it would be some combination of him and Carson Kelly and Stephen Vogt is there. You definitely don't want to roster three catchers in a one catcher. That's for sure. The Orioles came to mind, Pedro Severino and Chance Sisco. They're okay. The Angels with Stassi and Kurt Suzuki, I feel like they're probably going to split time. The Twins, what's going to happen with Mitch Garver? I mean, they have a prospect in Ryan Jeffers, which they seem pretty excited about. Are they going to split time there? I guess that's a possibility as well. So we're going to get into some ADP and some players in particular. Just want to quickly promote a few things. We've reached that point of the year where there's a lot of sports going on at once. NBA, college hoops, hockey. Does anybody even watch hockey anymore? Anyway, that's why we just wanted to tell you that about the CBS Sports app and how it's not just the best scoring app for your phone, but it's also where you get breaking news alerts, stories by all of our CBS Sports writers, including all of us here on this podcast, standings, schedules, team pages, and all the sportsy digital stuff that you're used to. And of course, if a game is airing on CBS, that means it's streaming on the CBS Sports app. Easy, right? Download it, re-download it if it's got that little cloud logo next to it on your phone. And we love those 5-star ratings, so don't hesitate to drop one for the app. If you do, tweet us a screenshot along with a mailbag question for us to use on an upcoming episode. Thanks, as always, for your support. And speaking of support, we want to thank everyone who's here watching us live so far tonight on YouTube and on Twitch. We'll be here whenever we record a podcast. Typically, it's going to be around 10 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights, so mark that on your calendars. And since this is our first night streaming, after we wrap up the catcher position preview podcast here, we'll take some of your questions. So stick around there in the chat. We'll be around for like 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it is. We'll take some of your questions towards the end. All right, so some ADP and the biggest questions and topics at the catcher position. First and foremost, we know JT Realmuto. He stands at the top of the position. The ADP is 40. He's going in the 4th round, and he's slowly climbing up. I feel like last week I mentioned it. It was at 42. The other day it was at 41. Now we're up to 40. So slowly creeping up for JT Realmuto. I wanted to do the case for and the case against drafting him where you need to. So which I feel like Chris is probably more likely to draft Realmuto, that just from what I've gained over the years. So I guess Chris will do you the case for, and Scott will do the case against. So get us started. Although it's not really hard to make the case for, Chris.
Yeah, the case for is kind of what I said earlier. He's the only, in my opinion, he's the only for sure starting caliber fantasy hitter who plays catcher. I think there are a few others who could get there, but for the most part, the most likely outcome for JT Realmuto in either head-to-head points or roto is that he's going to, if not be the number one catcher, it's going to take someone else having a career year to beat him. He's, arguably the only true 5-category contributor at the position. And there's a massive gap. For me, I think it's 100 spots in my overall rankings between Realmuto and the number 2 catcher. Although I think I have him ranked lower than the consensus, so that's kind of interesting.
You really hate those other catchers then if it's 100 spot draw.
It's 70 spots. Sorry, Will Smith is 129.
Okay. All right.
Speaking of Real Muto, the Roto rank at the catcher position for JT over the past 3 years, number one, and number one since joining the Phillies in 2019, 273 batting average, 825 OPS for Real Muto, and his ranks among catchers during that time: first in runs, first in RBI, first in steals, and tied for second in home runs.
I think he's like second in games played too. I
Yeah,
think it's like either him or Yasmani Grandal, and Grandal has played like a decent amount of first base and DH.
and the power has climbed in correlation with moving over to Philly, which I think we all kind of expected, but it's nice to see it actually reflected in the numbers. The isolated power, which is slugging percentage minus batting average, has climbed each of the past 3 seasons for JT Real Muto. Scott, the case against drafting the best catcher in fantasy baseball at pick 40 in the 4th round.
Well, that's the biggest issue, is what you'd be passing up to take him there in the middle of the 4th round. It's so important to get enough high-end arms early on, and they're going to start to run out not long after that. And even if you're not going an arm there, it's likely that somebody like Alex Bregman or Anthony Rendon, a bat that shows legitimate first-round potential, is still available there in the middle of round 4. And so those are just more attractive prizes to me than, as big as of an advantage as Real Muto is at the catcher position. It's just not an especially consequential position. And, you know, maybe you're the one guy who has an advantage over everyone else there, but if you're not, you know, you're not that disadvantaged compared to the rest of the league, because nobody else has anybody that great there. So, you know, if it gets to round 6 and Real Muto's still there, I start to think about it. I have him ranked 53rd in my Roto rankings, but 40th, 4th round like that is too rich for me.
Yeah, here's the case against him. You're only drafting him that high because he's a catcher.
Mm-hmm.
The guys who are being drafted around him, Corey Seager's 1 spot ahead of him in the overall ADP. The hitters, excuse me. Rafael Devers is right behind him. Marcelo Zuna is the next guy, and then Tim Anderson.
Yep.
Those guys are just better fantasy players, and, you know, I think across the board much better than Real Muto is. So, you know, if he wasn't a catcher, I'm not sure he'd be a top 100 pick.
And this is going to come off as me sounding like a hater. I certainly am not, because I think that JT Real Muto is awesome, but I feel like as great as he is, he doesn't really separate himself away from other catchers as much as we think he does. So number 1 in Roto each of the past 3 seasons, he hasn't finished better than the 61st best player in that format during that time. So he hasn't even been a top 60 player yet. You have to draft him inside the first 4 rounds in Roto drafts. And then in head-to-head points leagues, there were 2 catchers who were better than him on a per-game basis in 2020, Salvador Perez and Will Smith. There were 3 catchers better than JT Real Muto in 2019 on a per-game basis, Mitch Garver, Gary Sanchez, and Will Smith again. So I feel like as good as he is,
kind of a compiler.
Yeah. So I don't know if like he really separates himself that much. So he's still really good, but to have to use a 4th round pick on JT Real Muto, that is the case for and against him. The next 3 catchers off the board in terms of ADP: in the 8th round, we have Salvador Perez at 89.5. In the 9th round, Will Smith at 103.3. More on him a bit later. In the 11th round, Wilson Contreras at 121.8. Salvador Perez versus Wilson Contreras. This was a debate that we had towards the end of last season, Scott, and early in the offseason. And I think recently you either texted me or wrote to me in a chat somewhere that you were going to swap those, that you were going to put Salvador Perez ahead of Wilson Contreras. And it sounds like Chris is the anti-Salvi guy, Salvi fantasy manager for this upcoming season. So, Scott, I will let you present the case for Salvador Perez versus Wilson Contreras, and then Chris will flip-flop.
Yeah, so it's really hard to believe the numbers Salvador Perez put up last year, just compared to the lengthy track record he has. I mean, he hit 100 points higher than we had seen him hit his last couple of healthy seasons. So I'm not I'm not really buying that, but like it's important to remember how big of a fantasy asset Salvador Perez was before last year. He is up there with Real Muto and the kind of playing time advantage he gets at the position. It's a big deal at this position because so many players sit so often. A lot of guys only start 4 times a week, and Perez, you're going to get, he starts virtually every game for the Royals, and he certainly provides power. So I don't think there's much downside to drafting him. I feel like we could probably look this up, but my perception is he was going about this same range, or not that much later than this last year when he was coming off Tommy John surgery and not the best season of his career, when there were a lot more concerns about him. So that's why I'm justifying him over Wilson Contreras. I think Contreras has more upside, especially since David Ross kind of took to playing him more than Joe Madden did. There was the DH spot available too, so that kind of had something to do with it. But there wasn't really anything in the underlying stats to suggest Contreras was a different player last year. So he kind of underachieved and was still really good and could probably be better than Perez on a per at bat basis. But between the playing time advantage Perez has historically had and that slim chance that really something did change for Perez at the plate and he might be some semblance of what he was in 2020, I think I gravitate to him more than I do Contreras at this point.
So for Perez, the ADP I mentioned is 89.5. But Scott, we've done some mock drafts recently. We've done 3 mock drafts in particular, one roto, one head-to-head points, one head-to-head categories. You have grabbed him in 2 of those drafts where he has slipped to 130, 136, and 117. So while the ADP is higher, you're right. Like he's been falling a little bit and not going, much earlier than someone like Wilson Contreras. The ADP for Salvador Perez last year, according to the NFBC, was 153.4. So
it was
he has moved up, but I mean, if you're getting him at like 130, then yeah, it's only a 20 pick difference from last year.
Right. So I guess relative to where I've been able to get him, I don't know if that's just because we're drafting with other analysts and nobody wants to be the sucker who buys into Salvador Perez, but like you get into round 11, round 12 range, it's like there's not much certainty attached to anybody at that point. So, at least you have a chance of giving yourself a real advantage at the weakest position in fantasy.
Chris, why do you hate Salvador Perez and why would you take Wilson Contreras ahead of him?
Yeah, I will not be the sucker for Salvador Perez. And it aligns with my overall philosophy. It's less anything that Salvador Perez does wrong than just you're buying at the high point in his value. This is the highest his ADP has been, according to NFBC historical ADP data, going back to at least 2017. And I would imagine it wasn't any higher before that. So I'm just generally opposed to paying for the guy coming off the career season. And that's especially true coming off of 2020. I think we know who he is. And who he is a guy who's probably not going to help you in batting average, probably going to hit around 25 home runs. He'll have decent runs and RBIs for a catcher, but not great because he is a truly bad on-base percentage guy. So you're probably looking at like a ceiling of 65 runs, which would actually be his career high by 8, and then probably around 80 RBI, which none of that is bad, but
yeah, I mean, it's good for all of that is good for a catcher, except for the batting average, which is.
Isn't it fairly likely James McCann can give you something very similar hitting in that Mets lineup? Not the same thing, but the fact that you're paying probably 8 rounds later to get James McCann, who might have more batting average potential with similar power. I don't know. Perez is, as much as, probably more than Real Muto, is a true compiler at the catcher position historically. Last season was really the only year where he wasn't.
So I think the biggest difference would be in the RBI, probably between
McCann will hit lower in the lineup.
Somebody like McCann, you're talking probably like a 20 RBI difference, 15 to 20.
Which isn't nothing.
And just just by virtue of the difference in playing time. You give the Perez an edge in all the counting stats, but that would probably be the biggest one.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference, and you've been consistent with this, Chris, is that you are not putting much stock into 2020. I tried to find out why Salvador Perez was so good, and I will point out the fact that he missed all of 2019 with Tommy John surgery. And if you remember, before 2019, this guy was an Iron Man. He played so many games. So I actually think that the year off helped Salvador Perez really kind of like rejuvenate his career, get his body back on track. And he came back and we saw what he did last year. I mean, with that being said, I mean, he had a 986 OPS, Salvador Perez did, and that was never higher than 792 like before in his career. So I'm not expecting an OPS over 900 again, but I will just say I also found this. Salvador Perez credited Royals special assignment hitting coach Mike Tozar with helping him develop a more consistent routine. Perez also mentioned a change in his plate discipline. Quote, "I'm just trying to be on time, try not to swing at bad pitches, try to get ahead of the count. I'm still aggressive. I just try to swing at good pitches." And that was evident in a career high 78.5% zone swing percentage. So, that is how often a batter swings at pitches inside the zone, which is a change. It's, it's something different from Salvador Perez that we've never seen before.
The counter to that would be that his outside zone swing was pretty much identical to his previous couple of seasons. And, maybe he really just did get more selective in the way that he remains aggressive. But given that we're talking about 37 games, it mostly seems like the answer to what did Salvador Perez do differently last year is, had his highest home run to fly ball ratio by 10 percentage points and had his highest BABIP by 64.
Those StatCast numbers were pretty good, Chris. They were pretty good there for Salvador Perez. Yeah. So it is a small sample size. It comes down to, which side of the fence you fall on for Salvi there. If I just straight up in a vacuum, I would take Salvador Perez over Wilson Contreras. If you told me for sure I can get Contreras 3 to 4 rounds later, then yeah, I agree. I probably would rather have that discount. But the name going in between both of those guys is Will Smith with an ADP at 103.3. Now, a fun fact on Will Smith, he has averaged more fantasy points per game than JT Realmuto in each of the past 2 seasons, though he's only played 91 games during that span. So a 937 OPS for Will Smith thus far in his career. And JT Realmuto is at 825. Does that mean I think Will Smith is going to be better? Not necessarily, but I think the upside is there, especially in the Dodgers lineup as well. So, Scott, just how good can Will Smith be? Because he made massive improvements in 2020.
Yeah, he's the most obvious breakout candidate at the position, which is the justification for him going as high as he did. He was kind of a 3 true outcomes guy when he first got called up, and through most of his minor league career, walked a lot, struck out a lot, but also showed big power at the position. And he added an outcome last year. He cut way down on his strikeout rate. It went from one of the worst to one of the best at the position, and he also walked even more. So, in terms of like per game production, let me see if I can pull up the actual number for that. In terms of per game production, 3.38. That was actually better than JT Realmuto fantasy points per game. It was behind only Salvador Perez at the position among everybody. So he has the potential to be the best catcher in baseball, I would say. But there are really 2 big issues with Will Smith. I'll get into one later. But the one I want to get into, the most obvious one, is the playing time. Why he rated much higher in per game production than in terms of overall production. And the Dodgers historically have been an organization that doesn't like to overtax their catchers. Even when Yasmani Grandal was there, it was frustrating how often he sat for whoever happened to be the backup that year. And we saw that with Will Smith, as good as he was, at least during the regular season. We saw that last year, and the regular season is of course what we're drafting him for. So if he's a guy who's playing at most 60% of the time, it's going to be hard for him to be top 5 at the position, no matter how good that per game production is.
And I have cited this before, Scott, that the Dodgers played 18 postseason games and Will Smith started 17 of them. However, I looked further into that today, and I realized that 7 of those 17 starts came at DH. And as of now, it seems like there's going to be no universal DH this season. So, especially in the World Series, 4 of his 6 starts came at DH. So, it's clear that they still trust Austin Barnes to a certain extent here. So, you're right. I mean, that could eat into the production on a per game basis. Will Smith can be awesome. The improvements he made from 2019 to 2020 were night and day. He cut his strikeout rate by about 10%, hit line drives 10% more of the time, cut his swinging strike rate. He walked more. So Chris, what do you think of Will Smith here at this ADP sandwich right in between these guys? Would you be willing to do it, or is it too early for you?
He's my number 2 catcher, and he bridges the gap between Real Muto is about 100 spots ahead of number 3, Wilson Contreras. So Will Smith kind of bridges the gap between the two of them. He's closer to Contreras in the rankings than Will Smith, but I have him closer to his ADP. And I just think if you're going to reach on one of the non-Real Muto catchers, I think you do it with the one who has, I mean, he's shown nothing but star potential in the majors. This isn't like, him and Salvador Perez, I think, played the same number of games in 2020. And so you could say, well, if you're skeptical of Perez, well, Will Smith did have the 2019 season, which we thought was unsustainable. And then he got, I think, significantly better in year 2. And, if you look at the minor league track record in the high minors, especially, he's played 161 games between AA and AAA. He had 40 home runs. He did only hit like 245. That's the mark against him, is that the batting average could be a real concern. And that's where the small sample size comes in. If he can sustain something like his 16% strikeout rate from last season, or the 22% rate he now has for his career in those 91 MLB games, I think you're looking at, potentially the best hitter at catcher on a per plate appearance basis by a, significant margin.
Again, that is Will Smith of the Los Angeles Dodgers. I want to ask you guys, why wouldn't we all just wait on Gary Sanchez, who's being drafted in round 14? Now, I have a theory on this. I think this is a result, Chris, of everybody who has ever drafted Gary Sanchez. They're just washing their hands. They're like, nope, we're coming together. This is a collective. Nope, we're done. We're done with Sanchez.
I mean, the answer to that question is because he's hit. Is he even a 200 hitter over the last 3 seasons combined? I don't think he is.
Can't answer.
If he is, he's exactly a 200 hitter over the last 3 seasons. His best average in that span is 232. So you have to go back to 2017 to find Gary Sanchez being anything but, frankly, a disaster, even for the catcher position.
Well, that's not true. He
batting
hit 34
average,
home runs.
No. I just mean in batting average.
Okay.
In that one specific category. I don't know. His swing seems broken. It's hard to understand exactly how this happens, but he still is one of the hardest hitters in baseball. He hits the ball incredibly hard. Max exit velo, average exit velo, hard hit rate, barrel rate. All of those things are really good. The problem is what happens when he doesn't hit the ball hard, which happens too often, or he hits it too hard into the air, way too high. He's at like a 17% infield fly ball rate over the last 2 seasons. He has, I think sold out for power in a way that, frankly, he doesn't need to. He hits the ball so hard, he doesn't need to sell out for power, but I have no reason to believe that's going to change. And so after being a pretty big Gary Sanchez guy, I'm kind of out-ish. I have him outside of my top 200 overall. He is my number 7 catcher in Roto, but not even a top 12 guy in head-to-head points for me.
This is by far the latest we've ever seen Gary Sanchez being drafted. Last year, the ADP was 78.2. Again, down at 163.3 right now as the 8th catcher off the board is Gary Sanchez. And maybe he's done. Maybe the swing is broken. Chris, I've watched a lot of Yankee games. Obviously, people see the Yankee stuff behind me here. But, he does have timing issues. He has a big leg kick and, can get inside his own head at times. But still, just like where he's going, I think that it is worth the risk based on the upside that he can provide. I mean, this is still someone who has had an OPS over 840 in 2 of the last 4 seasons. So if he could just figure out the strikeout rate, his BABIP was like incredibly low last year
He's
as well.
the only catcher who could realistically end up with 40 home runs in a season.
That is correct. Scott, where do you stand?
I'm more with you. Like the cost is so low that I don't like, even if he's a total dud, I don't think you're going to regret taking him that much. And we're so willing to give a pass to so many hitters who drastically underachieved in 2020, specifically with the strikeout rate. That was Sanchez's biggest problem, 36% strikeout rate. That's like Miguel Sano stuff. Not many hitters can get away with that, but it was much worse than what he usually delivers in that category. And if we're tossing out 2020 because it was a weird year, he didn't have in-game video access, whatever, then that 2018 season where he hit 170 something, 186, that really stands out as the outlier for his career. And he has 3 great seasons and 4 otherwise. So, if everybody was giving him a pass in 2020, maybe I'd be the guy who won it. But since nobody seems willing to, I'll take advantage of that.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I'm willing to take the risk there on Gary Sanchez. The last question, big topic I wanted to ask before we move on to our sleepers, breakouts, and busts was, and I mentioned catcher tandems. If you play in a daily lineup league, are they becoming more prevalent? Because, when I was going through my rankings, it seemed like more than ever before, I couldn't just choose out for certain a 100% starter for a team. And there was specifically at least 10 teams that I noticed: Baltimore, Houston, the Angels, Minnesota, Seattle, Tampa Bay, Texas, Toronto, Arizona, Cincinnati. Those were just 10 that stood out. There might be others where I feel like more teams are going towards this tandem approach than we've ever seen before. Scott, have you noticed anything like this while doing your rankings?
Yeah, it's not something I've ever chronicled to see how much it's changed, how quickly, but it's over the years, it's something I've noticed too, where it's more of a split role behind the plate for a lot of teams than having a true starter and a true backup, which is part of the reason why it's become such a low priority position for me, because there are so few who are even able to stand. Even if they're good hitters, they don't get the playing time to become standout fantasy options, So yeah, I'm with you.
If you're watching on video, don't go anywhere. But if you are listening on the podcast, we are going to take a quick break, and we're going to give you sleepers, breakouts, and busts when we return right after this. All right, so let's jump into our sleepers, breakouts, and busts for the catcher position. Chris, why don't you get us started with a sleeper of yours here in 2021?
Yeah, I actually just wrote my catcher preview piece, and I chose a sleeper, breakout, and bust for each position. And Joey Bart is my sleeper. It's both easy and hard to find a sleeper at catcher, because they're all going so late basically that basically any of them could be sleepers outside of the top 10. But Joey Bart, look, yes, he was awful last year. 41 strikeouts in 33 games, 111 plate appearances. That's like a 35% strikeout rate. That is Gary Sanchez-esque. And he did not hit for Gary Sanchez-esque power. But we're a year removed from him being, one of the elite prospects in baseball. I think the consensus top prospect at the position. He had a 912 OPS at AA. Overall in the minors, 875. Didn't really have the plate discipline issues. 29 homers in 130 minor league games. Look, the catcher who doesn't struggle upon making it to the majors is relatively rare. And so I'm not going to knock Joey Bart for, struggling in 33 games in a weird season where, he only faced AL and NL Central or AL and NL West teams, and just generally didn't get the real major league experience. So I'm willing to give him another chance. The question, of course, is whether the Giants are. And this is one where, you might not even be drafting Joey Bart. I am ranking him as a top 24 catcher if he doesn't make the team in spring training, which seems, pretty likely, or at least possible. Maybe I'll move him down if that becomes more of a sure thing. But, if he does get the chance, if Buster Posey, who's had a ton of hip injuries, but who I also like as a sleeper, gets hurt. Or if Brandon Belt, who's had a ton of injury issues, gets hurt and they play Buster Posey at first base more, I will be excited to have Joey Bart on my team when he gets called up.
Joey Bart is currently the 27th catcher off the board at pick 327.3, according to Fantasy Pros. Scott, your favorite sleeper at the catcher position?
Well, I could say Gary Sanchez, but I won't since we just got into him quite a bit. Somebody who I think might have as much upside and was just as underwhelming last year as Gary Sanchez was Mitch Garver, who it's easy to forget just how good he was in 2019. You go back and look at those numbers, 31 homers in 93 games, 359 plate appearances, and he had 31 homers, a 995 OPS, good on base skills too. Just in terms of fantasy points per game, I think ISO, basically everything which you use to measure how good a catcher is in fantasy. He was a distant number one last year, except of course total production.
2019
trailed Real Muto. Yeah, in 2019. Yeah, not last year. Last year he was awful. I think everybody expected some kind of step back, but I mean, he was just a total disaster last year. Hit 167, strikeout rate was ridiculously bloated. It was clear that something in his process was messed up because you don't go from that amazing to that horrible overnight like that. So, we talk about how Sanchez is being discounted going 160 something on average. Mitch Garver is going 215th. So like almost free in a mixed league sense. And that makes it so there's not much downside to taking him as your number one catcher. And because catcher's a position where nobody rosters two players, there's going to be a decent guy, at least in a one catcher league. There's going to be somebody decent you can fall back on the waiver wire if it doesn't pan out. But I mean, that upside he showed in 2019 was ridiculous enough that for no cost, I'll take a flyer on him again.
Mitch Garver was wrecked by injuries last season, so I think that played a lot into his production being where it was at in 2020. Scott, I did just want to follow up and ask regarding the playing time. They have Ryan Jeffers, who's regarded as one of the top catching prospects in baseball, a former second-round pick, and a really good framer as well. How do you see the playing time working out early here for the Minnesota Twins catchers?
Oh, I think it'll be a split role to begin the season. Mitch Garver didn't start out 2019 with a big share of the playing time either. And he began to earn more. Obviously, them being an AL team, if Mitch Garver is, well, I guess you want to play DH because they have Nelson Cruz there. But I think he got some time at first base in 2019 just because they were looking
at so too, but he only played 2 innings. That's surprising. I did think he played first base that year.
All right, so scratch that whole thing. I just think if Mitch Garver is hitting, they'll get him in the lineup, especially because I don't think the upside offensively for Ryan Jeffers really compares. And if Mitch Garver isn't hitting enough, then he'll be the backup, and obviously we can move on in fantasy. So it's really, I think it's just entirely contingent on how Garver performs, and you'll have to deal with more off days at the start of things. But if he gets rolling, then obviously he's going to find at bats.
Sleeper for me, I'm going with Alejandro Kirk. Chris, what did you used to call these guys? The big beefy something?
Big beefy baseball boys?
Big beefy baseball boys. Yeah, Alejandro Kirk, I think, would fit that bill. A fun gentleman to watch play baseball, but an awesome hitter in the minors. Seriously, 315 batting average with a 918 OPS. Across
60 strikeouts, only 89 walks.
Yeah, the plate discipline is legit. And
while being really young, he was only 21 last season.
Yep. And he hit the ball really hard too. Only 20 batted balls last season, but he had a 95 mile per hour average exit velocity. 10 of those 20 batted balls were classified as hard hits. So I don't want him as my first catcher if you play in a 1 or 2 catcher league, but because Danny Jansen is still there, and I think they could split some playing time early on. But kind of like what you said about Mitch Garver, they're 2 different players, Scott, Kirk and Garver. But I think if Kirk hits well, especially in that Blue Jays lineup, I think that it won't be long before he overtakes someone like Danny Jansen. So I'm pretty excited about Alejandro Kirk. Chris, give me a breakout at the position.
A breakout at the catcher position. How about a guy who probably won't play much catcher, Dalton Varsho? He is, I said JT Realmuto is the only 5-category contributor at catcher. Dalton Varsho is the one other guy who could really be a legitimate 5-category contributor. And it's not like, oh, he could steal 9 bases. Dalton Varsho could legitimately steal 20 bases. And he figures to play pretty regularly between his ability to play catcher, but also, likely to be the primary center fielder. I think he could be someone who hits 250 and goes 20-20. And if he plays every day and establishes himself as a viable option every day at center field, you could be looking at something kind of similar to what we saw with Isaiah Kiner Falefa last season, where he played pretty much every day. And as someone in the chat noted, Kiner Falefa actually is keeping catcher eligibility at Yahoo, which is kind of big for Yahoo leagues. He's a potential top 15 catcher there.
Well, Chris, have you ever looked at first base in your life? Like just looked at the base?
Yes.
So that means you have catcher, you have first base eligibility on Yahoo.
Yes. Yeah, that's generally how it works. But Dalton Varsho, he wasn't great in his limited time in the majors, but 3 steals, 3 homers, and did have a higher average sprint speed than JT Realmuto. The speed is legitimate, and it's not just fast for a catcher. So I think if he does play every day, Dalton Varsho is a top 12 catcher in Roto for sure. And, someone I'm thrilled to get as my number 2 catcher if I can go do it.
And if you draft Dalton Varsho, do not use him in the outfield. Make sure that you use him at catcher because that's where he is most valuable.
Although, look, if he goes 250, 20-20, he's going to be a stud catcher, but that plays in the outfield.
Those are pretty lofty projections, Chris. Not that you're expecting that, but I guess it is within his range of outcomes. He was really good in the minor leagues, Dalton Varsho. So a name that they've been talking about the past couple of seasons in the Arizona Diamondbacks organization. The batting average was very bad in 2020, but still had 3 homers and 3 steals in 37 games last year. So look at on the low end, 10-10, that will definitely play.
He went 18-21 in 108 games in 2019 at Double-A.
Yeah, no, he's definitely an interesting.
Not out of the realm of possibility.
Scott, a breakout for you at the catcher position.
So I think Will Smith is the obvious one, but I'm going to pass on him because I want him for a different category. I'm going to say Sean Murphy, who I feel like has a lot of similarities to Will Smith. He was top 10 percentile in the league in, 90th percentile in the league in exit velocity and hard hit rate last year. He walks a ton. Had a 364 on base percentage last year and 821 OPS. Like, he definitely has the power. He definitely has the on base skills to be a fantasy asset, but A's just didn't play him often enough was the problem for him last year. They'd start him like 2 out of every 3 games for stretches, 3 out of every 4 games for stretches, just not consistent enough for him to really make an impact in fantasy. Jonah Heim was the guy who was splitting at bats with the most, and he was recently traded to the Rangers. So the backup option they have for Murphy isn't great. Murphy's a standout defensively, so you'd think they'd want him behind the plate as much as they could. I have more hope in his playing time going up, actually, than I do Will Smith's, and he can be had for much, much cheaper. Sean Murphy is going 179th overall. He's my 13th catcher. So in one catcher league, certainly, I expect he'll be somebody I end up with a lot.
Yeah, the ADP for Sean Murphy is
179.
179 right now as the 10th catcher off the board. Scott mentioned he has him as at 13. I have him at 9, so I'm pretty optimistic. And my breakout is Sean Murphy. Scott, we are simpatico here. Massive, massive September for him. Hit 277 with an OPS over 1,000, 5 home runs. It's only 16 games, so it's a small sample, but he had a 20% walk rate, 22% strikeout rate during that month. So I do think the playing time will go up as well. So even in a 1-catcher league with that type of walk OBP type of upside, definitely interested in Sean Murphy having a big season here with the Oakland A's. Chris, get us started with a bust here rather quickly if you could.
Yeah, Salvador Perez.
Boo.
He's a 30-year-old coming off the best season of his career by far in a 37-game season. I don't think, if you've listened to the podcast so far, you've heard this already, but Salvador Perez seems like the most obvious bust candidate at the position. Having said that, he'll probably hit 245 with 25 homers and probably still be a viable starter. I'm not going to pay the premium for that.
Man, hurts my heart. I'm a big Salvador Perez. Chris, think of some kind of wager that we'll put on Salvador Perez for this season. Batting average, home runs, or something. I don't know. Whatever you want. We'll do a little gentleman's bet here on Salvador Perez. Think about it. You let me know. Scott, who was a bust for you at the catcher position?
All right, so I wasn't calling Will Smith a breakout because I wanted to call him a bust. And I do think you can call somebody both a breakout and a bust without being intellectually dishonest, but it's hard for people to wrap their heads around. So I'll be the guy who says bust here, since so many people are elevating him already. And the stat I wanted to give about him earlier, but I was holding back for later, in addition to the playing time concerns I have for him that aren't being factored into his ranking, he, so much of the enthusiasm for him is based on that 16% strikeout rate he had during the very short regular season when he played 37 of the 60 games. In the playoffs, his strikeout rate was 32%. It was twice that. So if you combine his regular season and postseason stats, assessing Will Smith on those combined stats versus just the regular season stats, he's one of the biggest losers in all of baseball, losing the most value. And like, if there was ever a year to combine regular season and postseason stats like that, this is the year, just to get a decent sample out of what a player did. He was probably facing better pitchers in the postseason than he did in the regular season by and large, but still doubling your strikeout rate from that for a guy who shocked us by having such a low strikeout rate, I think it's noteworthy.
Will Smith, last thing I'll add there, Scott, I know you were worried a little bit about the playing time. You cited the 37 games. He landed on the IL last year with neck inflammation. So it wasn't like he was around for all 60 games and only played 37. So he did have
I was just pointing out how especially small the sample, the 2020 sample size was for Will Smith.
Yeah, I think, him and Mitch Garver are two guys who I kind of think I look more at the overall package of what they've done in the majors. And in Smith's case, he's got 424 plate appearances between the postseason and regular season across 2 seasons, and he has a 24.3% strikeout rate. That probably feels more repeatable than the 16% strikeout rate or the 36% from the playoffs.
32.
So that's more my expectation.
Scott, any prospects we need to know about at the catcher position that we actually expect to make an impact this year?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we mentioned a few already. Dalton, no, he doesn't count as a prospect anymore, but your guy Alejandro Kirk does. Also, Sam Huff of the Rangers, who isn't expected to make the opening day roster, even though he was great in a brief look at the end of last season. He has 70 grade power, strikeout issues, which, always have a potential to ruin a guy at the major league level. But the power is what we saw from him when he got his first chance to impact in the majors. He had 3 homers and 3 doubles, and I think only like a 10-game stretch, and just looked like a potentially impact bat at a weak position. So I don't think it'll be long before he's up and contributing for the Rangers. And I think, he's somebody you could call a sleeper for sure. Joey Bart, at some point he may contribute. Not exactly sure when that's going to be, but he could. Those are the biggest ones. I mean, Adley Rutschman is the top catcher prospect, and I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility.
I'd be a little shocked if we saw him. I feel like the Orioles have been very patient with their prospects.
Yeah. I mean, he's obviously a different class of prospect than they're used to, but I wouldn't be counting on him making an impact in 2021.
Let's wrap up with some ADP review and hit on some of the names that we haven't talked about yet to this point. Just remind everyone, JT Realmuto, he's going in the 4th round. Salvador Perez in the 8th round. Will Smith in the 9th round. Again, this is all 4 12-team leagues. Wilson Contreras going in the 11th. And Yasmani Grandal is also going in the 11th round. He's going, actually, that probably doesn't make sense. I just realized because he's going 19 picks apart as Wilson from Wilson Contreras, which means he would not be going in the 11th. That'd be like the 13th round. Anyway, Yasmani Grandal at 140.5. Chris, he's 1 year older, and he kind of had a down year last year. Who was the real Yasmani Grandal? You expecting a bounce back?
I've used the term compiler a few times. Yasmani Grandal is one of the ultimate compilers at the position. He's basically just a power and volume stats guy, but he should be good for those things. I think, the final numbers, I don't think will look that different from Salvador Perez.
Scott, what do you think? Yasmani Grandal.
I mean, he's 32 and took a step back last year, and I worry about catchers once they get into their 30s. So I'm kind of on Grandal where everyone else is with Sanchez, where I don't really think he's bouncing back. But I mean, the difference there is Grandal was still usable last year, even if he was worse.
You jump down 17 picks here to the 12th round. Travis d'Arnaud going off the board at pick 140.5. That's where I messed up. I wrote the wrong ADP for the wrong guy. But Travis d'Arnaud going one round later, Scott, with your Atlanta Braves. Potentially an enviable position here. He was batting cleanup in the postseason. He hit the ball harder than ever before, but also someone who's kind of a journeyman at this point, and he's dealt with a lot of injuries. So what do we think about d'Arnaud?
Yeah, I mean, the difference between him and Salvador Perez, both catchers who've been around a long time and didn't do anything close to what they did last year until they did it, is that Salvador Perez has a much softer landing if he regresses to his usual numbers than Travis d'Arnaud does. So I
will point out d'Arnaud was good in 2019 after he left the Mets. Once he got to the Rays, he wasn't fantasy baseball good, but he had like one amazing month. Good.
He had like one amazing month with the Rays. Yeah. And so nobody was buying into him that hard last year based on it. But yeah, I mean, maybe those improvements were proved to be more sustainable. And that's what we saw last year. I think his ADP is fine. I think there comes a point where you just have to cross your fingers if you want to have a respectable catcher. And I don't think anybody's really overpaying for him, but I don't have a lot of confidence that he's going to repeat anything close to last year's numbers.
Going about 20 picks later than Travis d'Arnaud in the 14th round of a 12-team league is Christian Vasquez, who I was going to select him as my bust, but just not a lot of conviction behind it. He is inconsistent. He hit 4 of his 7 home runs in the first 5 games of the season. Then he hit 7 home runs over his next 34 games, and then 3 home runs over the final 8 games. So do with that what you will.
2019, you mean?
No, in 2020.
Okay.
But what do you think about him, Chris, going in this range as like a top 12 catcher?
He plays a ton. That's one thing he's got going for him. He played 138 games in 2019 and 47 in 2020, and only 4 of those in 2020 were DH, but he will still have the DH option. I think he's pretty good. I think he's boring, but he's going to give you a good batting average, and I think he's a non-zero power hitter now, whereas he used to be a full zero power hitter. So I think you're looking at someone who can hit, 280, 290 with 10 home runs. And in 2019, I think there were only 2 or 3. I think there was only one catcher in 2019 who hit 280 with double-digit home runs, which is stunning. And it's even more stunning that it was Wilson Ramos.
Yikes. And we haven't even mentioned his name yet, Wilson Ramos. Right after Christian Vasquez, Gary Sanchez, we already spoke about him going off the board, pick 163.3. Then in the 15th round, Austin Nola, we haven't spoke about yet, 172.8. He has played 127 career games, 271 hitter with an 808 OPS. He seems very solid, Scott. He's probably going to bat towards the bottom of a Padres lineup. What do you think about Austin Nola?
Yeah, I think he and James McCann are very similar. I could almost flip a coin who I'd rather take between them. They're both fine if you don't get a catcher that has something like standout potential. I don't think either of them do, but they're both fine at the position. They're going to be serviceable starters for you, probably. I didn't mention Luis Campusano when I was mentioning prospects because he's actually DH only technically to begin the season, but that's just because he made one major league appearance and it was a DH. He's a catcher for the Padres, a catcher prospect, the next in line if something goes wrong for Austin Nola, clearly next in line since they traded Francisco Mejia this offseason. And he's a very exciting prospect for the Padres. So that's something to keep in mind with Nola.
Right after Nola goes off the board, we have Sean Murphy, we mentioned, in the 16th round. Dalton Varsho also goes in the 16th round. And then James McCann, who you just mentioned, Scott, going in the 17th round at pick 192.5. He's been really good the past couple of seasons with the White Sox since the start of 2019. McCann is batting .276, 25 home runs, an .808 OPS, and a 116 weighted runs created plus. He's going to strike out a good amount, but he also hits a lot of line drives, which supports his high BABIP. So James McCann, for me, that's really the cutoff as who I would want as a starting catcher in a one catcher league. But I wouldn't mind him as my first catcher in a two catcher league as well. This is where we see this massive drop in ADP. There's 30 picks that go after James McCann, and then we see Mitch Garver down at 224.8. We already spoke about him, and then another massive drop. So Garver's he's just on an island by himself here. A 45 pick drop in ADP, and then there are 5 names going between picks 270 and 300. Those names are Buster Posey, Yadier Molina, Danny Jansen, Pedro Severino, and Jorge Alfaro. Posey, Molina, Jansen, Severino, Alfaro. What do you think, Chris?
That's perfectly fine. all of those guys play catcher, and they're not terrible.
That is,
I've lost a lot of my enthusiasm for Danny Jansen. I think Buster Posey is a very viable bounce back candidate. You know, I mentioned that 280 double digit homers range. I think that's probably. I think Buster Posey's probably pretty likely to do that. I know he hasn't hit double digit homers since like 2017. But it's worth remembering the last couple of seasons that he played, 2018, 2019, he was dealing with pretty bad hip issues that he did have surgery on before in the 2020 off season. Obviously sat out the entire 2020 season. So he's going to be about as fresh as he'll ever be. And I think Buster Posey is still, at the very least, a very good batting average source. And we'll probably, that Giants lineup, sneaky, not terrible. I think I want to say Steamer. I think I saw that Steamer has the Giants projected for more hitters with an above average WOBA than any other team, which is kind of wild. They don't have any stars, but they got a lot of guys.
Yeah, it's like the island of misfit toys there with the San Francisco Giants. We're still waiting to see what's going to happen in Oracle Park in terms of if their archways are going to be opened or closed. Last year they were closed, and it really helped drive up offense. So something to pay attention to as well. Last group that we'll hit on here, 3 going in from picks 300 to 325, Alejandro Kirk, Carson Kelly, and Wilson Ramos. Scott, what do you think about this group of 3? Any that you would like as your catcher 2?
I think they're fine. I'm not really sure how the Diamondbacks are going to handle their catcher position. I kind of, when I first put together my rankings, I need to move Dalton Varsho up basically because I didn't see him being like a full-time outfielder for them. I figured they'd go out and get somebody else, and maybe he and Kelly would split at bats there, a lefty-righty thing. But since it looks like they're going to have no choice but to play Varsho in that outfield a lot. Kelly, he was a guy we all had in our top 10 last year. So I think as your number 2 catcher for next to nothing, that's fine. I mean, Wilson Ramos has a pretty good track record as decent source of batting average without zero power. Like I think all of these guys are fine. I mean, even going back to like Posey, Molina, Severino, I don't think it's a disaster if you end up with them as your number 1 catcher, even in a 2-catcher league, and pair them with, somebody with upside like an Alejandro Kirk or I guess you can't have Sam Huff if he's beginning the year in the minors. You wouldn't want him as your second catcher, but like Tom Murphy coming back from injury, who has big power potential. Maybe strike gets out too much and won't help in batting average, but he will hit a lot of home runs, and he is a guy who should at least get 50% of the bats in Seattle, splitting with Luis Torrens. So it's a position where you shouldn't feel obligated to invest a lot. If you love the value of a guy, whether it's Real Muto sliding to round 6 or Gary Sanchez, being there in round 14, or Mitch Garver in round 20 or whatever, then go ahead and accept the discount and hope you get more than you paid for it. But if the value's never there, then just take whatever comes to you, because somebody's going to emerge on the waiver wire, and you're not going to be at that big of a disadvantage, even if you have just low-end contributors like Wilson Ramos there.
Chris, in 30 seconds or less, the catcher that you are most likely to draft this season, all things considered.
It's going to be a boring choice, but I think it's probably Buster Posey. I think I'm probably going to end up with Buster Posey, and I'm fine with him as a low end number 1 if it comes to it. And I think I'll have him on pretty much all of my 2-catcher league teams, because my philosophy at catcher is kind of like the Hippocratic Oath, just first do no harm. And I think Buster Posey is one of the guys at catcher who won't hurt your team.
Mercy!
Over 30 seconds.
Come on.
That's a bad Chris. Scott, all things considered, the catcher that you will draft the most in 2021.
Well, so far it's been Salvador Perez, but that's because I keep getting him at a discount. If we're going by ADP, I would say Mitch Garver. Going beyond the top 200, just try for the upside. If it doesn't work out, move on. But I haven't actually drafted him yet, so we'll see.
Stick to your guns. I appreciate it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do with Gary Sanchez. I'm going to have a lot of Gary Sanchez. I'll say both New Yorkers. I think James McCann comes at a really good discount as well, so I don't mind him as my first catcher, as I mentioned, regardless of format. So if you are watching us right now on YouTube or Twitch, we are going to take some of your questions. If you're listening on the podcast side of things, we're going to wrap up here for Scott and Chris. I am Frank. Thank you all for listening, and we will be back again on Thursday. Bye-bye. It's just, you see, this is what happens when I'm actually ending the podcast for those that are watching right now. It doesn't go very well. So now you actually had an opportunity to see how it goes.
Honestly, I'm a little upset that we never live streamed Adam trying to close out a podcast, because it was always just an absolute joy to behold. Oh, it was a disaster every single time.
I can't imagine anything being worse than every single one of my close.
Right, but that's the thing, is because you just say bye-bye. You just like, all right, we're done. And Adam would always like try to wrap it up, and it's just like it was never good.
No, the way
he is so good at everything except for that.
I try to just get out as fast as possible. So here we are, Fantasy Baseball Today After Dark. We'll be taking some of your questions here on the Fantasy Baseball Today YouTube and in Twitch as well. So send some of those questions in, whether it is regarding catchers, anything that's fantasy baseball related. It can be life related. It can be about Chris's cats. It could be about, Scott's latest video games, whatever you want to ask us about. We are here. Fantasy Baseball Today. So let's see. I'm going to scroll up, see if we have some questions thus far. In the meantime, Scott, give me the second catcher. The catcher 2 you're most likely to draft.
Alejandro Kirk, your guy. Yeah, I think he's pretty safe with the bat. It's just a question of playing time.
All righty, here we go. We got some questions rolling in now. Let's see if I would throw this up on the screen, but this is a really big question. So I'm just going to read it. This one's from the CB Kid. It's over on Twitch. Keeper question for you guys. 14-team head-to-head 5x5 categories. We keep 4 players in the round they were drafted in. Down to my last pick, Liam Hendricks in the 10th, Kenta Maeda in the 11th, or Ryan Presley in the 16th. I also have Hyunjin Ryu in the 11th and Carlos Carrasco in the 9th. Definitely a Scott White question since he loves pitching. Are yours
definitely Maeda?
Yeah. If you had to just choose those three, Scott, Hendricks in the 10th, Maeda in the 11th, Presley in the 16th. What do you think?
It's Maeda. If they were all kept on equal terms, it'd be Maeda. So,
he mentions his other three keepers are Mookie in the 1st. He has 8th overall pick. Jose Ramirez in the 2nd, and Tim Anderson in the 5th. All right. I mean, I might look at a Ryu in the 11th or a Carlos Carrasco in the 9th over some of those other names. What do you think about that, Scott?
I maybe Carrasco over Tim Anderson, especially since you have so many steals taken care of with Mookie and Ramirez. I don't know that you need to keep Tim Anderson at face value. Basically, rather get the high end arm at a discount. Carlos Carrasco in the 9th. I think I might do that instead of Tim Anderson.
Oh, we got this one from Omar in YouTube. Let's see. We'll throw this one up here on the screen. What are some cheap guys who will be good for batting average in a categories league? Chris, what do you think?
Is this specifically just catchers?
I
don't think
I don't think there's going to be many catchers. Give me one catcher and one non-catcher.
It's a lot easier to do the catcher because it's Buster Posey.
Alejandro Kirk, I'll throw out there as well.
Yeah, potentially. A potential cheap overall hitter. Boy. I mean, a hitter who's too cheap just in general is Trey Mancini.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably, assuming he's going to be, cleared to play, and I believe he has been cleared to play, and he's going to be an everyday player. This is a guy who hit 291 with 35 homers the last time we saw him. He was really, really good. So, Trey Mancini, whose ADP is 184.3 according to Fantasy Pros. Just a good source of everything except stolen bases, I think.
I got a Facebook message recently from a doctor who works in like the cancer field, and he was like giving me like all these kind of updates with like Trey Mancini and Carlos Carrasco, just based on like research that he's done before. Oh, so here you go. I got this from Brian Daniel on Facebook a couple of weeks ago. He is an oncologist. He's in Canada, and he said, warning about Trey Mancini. As far as I'm aware, stage 3 colon cancer had 6 months of chemo. Standard treatment is FOLFOX with high rates of neuropathy in hands and feet. So I worry he will struggle with his balance, running, feeling the bat. So take that for what it's worth, but I thought it was really interesting that he provided there. Another one he said about Cookie Carrasco, CML is incurable, but good odds on 10-plus year survival. So he's ongoing tablet treatment that might cause some fatigue, but showed good endurance last season, and I bet on him last draft season, and it paid off. So, all right. Appreciate any type of advantage that we can get, especially with some insight there regarding some of the guys coming back from cancer treatment. This one is from Nick over on Twitch. Hey guys, what round have you guys seen Francisco Lindor going in? I think he's very interesting going into the huge market of New York. Seems like the perfect fit. His ADP is like right around 16. So the middle of the second round, right, Scott, is where we've consistently seen him go.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Lindor go anywhere but the second round. And I think that's appropriate. I think he's basically the same player he's always been. The underlying numbers last year didn't tell a different story, even if his base numbers were down a little bit. And I don't even think his base numbers were down that much. It's just there were so many outlier performers around the league in a shortened season that it made it look worse than it actually was. I think Lindor's the same as he always was, and round 2 is as late as you could have ever hoped to get him.
Our guy, Billy Palmer, says, best fantasy baseball podcast going. Appreciate that. And he also had a question regarding Kiner Falefa in leagues where he has catcher eligibility. So, Chris, I'll throw this one your way, considering you are the Dalton Varsho guy. It's kind of a similar situation. You're going to get some out-of-position playing time and steals with Kiner Falefa if he still has catcher eligibility. Where would you rank him in, say, a Roto League?
Yeah, and he does have catcher eligibility in Yahoo. I think that's probably the only provider where he will, but I think he'd be in the 15 to 20 range. He's a I think he's unlikely to hit for double-digit power, but I think he's someone who could be, a helpful batting average source. And I mean, frankly, he could be a contributor in the two hardest categories to find at catcher, which is batting average and stolen bases.
While having a huge playing time advantage.
Yeah, I think he played every single game last year, and he's
Yeah.
likely to play every day this year, which could make the runs and RBI, fine. And it's not out of the question that he hits double-digit home runs. It's just, somewhat unlikely, I think.
Yeah, I think I'd be a little bit more bullish on him. I'd probably have him inside the top 12. Again, this is kind of Falefa if he has catcher eligibility. I've done a few NFBC drafts. Those are 15-team roto where he's wound up as like my middle infielder, which is not great, but I think like you can get 10 homers and 20 steals and maybe an okay batting average. So again, that is Isaiah Kiner Falefa from our guy here, Billy Palmer. Another question. This is from JoJo. AL only keeper, Scott, Giancarlo Stanton or Salvi Perez?
Do you have a catcher already? Do you have a DH already? Is your DH spot full? I guess that's really the first question.
I think the real question is it two catcher or not? If it's a two catcher AL only, which should definitely not be a thing.
That is.
But if it is, then it's Sal.
Yeah.
I think just the fact it's AL in general, two catcher or one, it's going to be so much harder to fill that spot with somebody decent. So I think I'd lean Salvi there, but it's close.
This one's from Robert Chavez. Should I keep Ryan McMahon in a 10-team points league or drop him for someone with higher upside? Chris, I know that you've loved Ryan McMahon over the years. What do you think?
Oh, I've been a big Ryan McMahon skeptic. I'm not sure you should keep Ryan McMahon in a 20-team points league.
Yeah, this is not good. 10-team league.
I mean, he's one of the guys, and I think David Dahl. Well, I guess we'll find out about David Dahl, but I think both of those guys wouldn't be major league hitters if it wasn't for Coors Field.
This is from T. Iono. Eddie Rosario has finished the season as a top 90 overall player each of the past 4 seasons, never gets the credit he deserves, and he'll be cheap.
Yep.
Pretty fair point there.
I was our last mock draft we did, I kind of came to the same realization where, basically once he signed with Cleveland and I knew at that point he'd have an everyday role. Maybe that's what everybody was waiting for, why the ADP is lagging. Because when a guy gets non-tendered like he did, I mean, low OBP guy, who knows what kind of role he's going to be into. But signing with Cleveland, they obviously need him in the outfield every day. His career numbers at Cleveland are amazing. I don't know if that elevates his value really, but it tells me he's not going to be disadvantaged by that park change. So
look,
he's
somebody
I'm happy to get as my third outfielder.
Someone's got to drive in runs there.
Yeah.
Hopefully, right? There's going to be a lot of one-zip games in Cleveland, one way or another. Either they're going to be on the winning side or losing side there in those games. Chris, how about this one? You get Richie Russian. He asks, thoughts on David Dahl in a couple of years? Why not this year?
So I mean, I feel like a big old dummy because I was the David Dahl skeptic for most of his first 3 years, and then I finally bought in last offseason when he said he was going to start running more, and he had his worst season and was barely usable, was not even usable even with Coors Field, sub 600 or sub 500 OPS. I'm not optimistic about his chances of being a good hitter outside of Coors Field because I believe he has an exactly average weighted runs created plus, which accounts for Coors Field. So I think he's an average hitter who isn't really going. Like I think he's kind of Nomar Mazara.
Man, no love for our guy David Dahl. We've got a follow-up question here. This one's for Chris. I have a question for you. I'm sorry that I notice this all the time. Why do you touch your forehead all the time when you speak? Is this a nervous thing?
Boy, I'm gonna just have all kinds of boy.
Way to make him self-conscious, Robert. Come on.
I mean, first of all, like nobody can make me self-conscious. I just am self-conscious. And people just give me new reasons to be self-conscious. And this is just one new thing. I have a lot of anxieties and a lot of tics. Like, I don't know if Scott remembers from sitting near me, but I tap my feet all the time, which must drive my downstairs neighbors crazy because my wife gets on me about it multiple times a day.
Yeah.
I'm just a nervous wreck. That is one of the many ways it manifests.
One of the things you probably noticed from sitting near me is like I whisper what I'm writing to myself constantly. I'm like,
he's just sitting there talking to himself like this.
I have to say out loud what I'm writing because I have to hear how it sounds. So
actually,
that's
one thing you don't do when you podcast by yourself that you used to do when we would podcast in person that always made me really anxious was you just like rock back and forth while you're talking.
Well, now that we're on video, I have to be more conscious of how I look. Otherwise, I probably would be rocking back and forth. Yeah, that's long been a tick of mine.
It always made me like really anxious.
Like while I'm reading or writing out text messages, I'll like make like faces as if the person that I'm texting can actually see like the reactions that I'm making. Like, no, I don't want to eat chicken and rice for dinner. You should have known that. So I'll just like make faces while I'm texting. They can see them, and that's clearly not the case. We'll take a few more of your questions here. Again, thank you for joining us. This is our first edition of Fantasy Baseball Today After Dark here on YouTube and Twitch. Let's see what else we got going on. This one again from the CB Kid. What's your guys' honest take on saves plus hold leagues? I keep flirting with the idea as the commish, but truly can't bring myself to do it. I will just say they open up the reliever pool massively, and I think they make it more about having that category makes it more about just drafting the best reliever, which is probably what fantasy should be. But at the same time, I kind of like the chase of saves and adding saves plus holds as a category just kind of seems like a cop out to me. What do you think, Scott?
That's where I am with it.
Yeah.
Of course, it rewards the combining the two rewards better relievers, but there are so many relievers. I think it would water it down so much. Like I feel like it would turn relief pitcher into the kicker position of baseball, where it's just like there's just too many guys out there that you don't really have to value anybody that much.
And I think
creating that kind of artificial scarcity with the saves gives relief pitcher purpose.
I think part of the problem also is that, like Scott said, there are a lot of there aren't guys who get 45 holds like you do with saves, but a lot of guys get 20 holds. In 2019, 26 different players had at least 20 holds. I'm looking up the saves leaders, but I would guess that there were not 26 different people who had 20 saves. And so I just think part of the problem is they're not concentrated enough. And so, yeah, it's just get a good middle reliever and they will get, 20 to 25 holds.
This one's from Gianluca Palmieri, head-to-head points dynasty league. What should the return for Wander Franco be? I am interested in hearing your opinion on this, Scott, as somebody who has Wander Franco in your Scott White dynasty league. So what do you think?
Meaning you have him, yeah.
The return should be?
Oh, well, that league's a little crazy. I would guess Gianluca Palmieri. Gianluca. I'll just stick with the first name, Gianluca. I would guess his league set up a little differently in a way that wouldn't put the same value on prospects and an appropriate term for the best prospect and base appropriate return. I'm totally bungling this answer. Sorry. A little worn out after the podcast. I don't know. It really depends on the economy of your league, the exact setup of the rules, how much minor leaguers are worth relative to major leaguers. But I would think 2 pretty high-end major leaguers at least is what you should ask for, and potentially more if the league economy is such that, it's obvious he's worth more than that.
Yeah. It's head-to-head points. I think it makes sense to maybe grab one pitcher and one hitter, just because like hitters have a longer shelf life in a dynasty context. So if you do want to back yourself up there and give yourself some depth for Wander Franco, I mean, this is the best prospect in baseball, so don't sell yourself short and try and get as much out of him as you possibly can. Someone asked how terrible was the Super Bowl? It was god awful. As someone
really horrible game.
As someone who bet on the Chiefs, it was even worse. I got lucky. I also bet on Gronk to score a touchdown, so it basically canceled out for me. But
wasn't it just like 2 years ago we had a 9-3 game or something? I'm not saying this past Super Bowl was good, but
at least that one had gave like I had no, because the problem is the Super Bowl. I don't know if this is like a hot take, but like the Super Bowl is not the best, and I feel the same way about the college national championship game. It's not the best viewing experience because the game is so long and there's so many commercial breaks, and the commercial breaks are so much longer than normal that you're talking about a four-hour football game. And so, at least when it's 9-3, you have a reason to be invested late into the game. Whereas I'll admit, by the fourth quarter, I had switched over to playing Warzone and just had the game off to the side.
Yeah, man, I don't blame you. Shout out to Scott. Scott was on Tom Brady and the Bucks. I asked him on Friday who he thought was going to win the Super Bowl, and he chose Tom Brady. So
can't cut out touchdown Tom.
I mean, hey,
it was all of the expertise from not watching any NFL football this year. So that's yeah. No, I'll admit I fell asleep for a stretch in the second half. 2 of the last 3 Super Bowls, I fell asleep for a stretch during it.
God, man, it was just not a good game. Last question I'll take here. This one's from Ross 0527. Luis Robert or Ryan Mountcastle. I think that we can all agree, regardless of format, we're taking Luis Robert. Even in a league where you get penalized for strikeouts, I think his upside is much higher than someone like Mountcastle. I'm
surprised at how much I like Luis Robert this season. I have him as a top 10 outfielder, in Roto, which I don't feel great about it, but I basically I just kind of, wherever I put Kyle Tucker, I just was like, I'll put Luis Robert one spot behind him.
That's not a bad idea, Chris. I have Kyle Tucker as my 8th outfielder in Roto. Yeah. I have Luis Robert number 10. So
yeah, I have Kyle Tucker 8, Luis Robert 9.
We're together there, banking on Luis Robert. Again, anybody who is watching, yes, we're going to be here Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights throughout February. And then we're going to up this to 5 nights a week in March, and obviously during the regular season as well. We're not going to normally take this many questions, but towards the end of a podcast, if we have some time available, we'll take maybe 5-10 minutes worth of questions. So we do appreciate everybody for tuning in now for this. And we will be back again Wednesday night and also on Thursday night. So let's see if I can get this closing done a little bit better. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank Staffel. Thank you all for listening and watching Fantasy Baseball today. We'll be back again on Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.